Welcome, listeners, to Streams of Resistance, a special series by the Wayward Wanderer, where we find out more about the far right and what people are doing about it, from the folks who are in the thick of it. In Part 3, we will be talking about Christian nationalism and the Exvangelicals who have left it behind. Alrighty, everyone. Welcome back to Streams of Resistance. Joining me now is podcaster Blake Chastain of the Post-Exvangelical. Welcome, Blake. It's good to have you on.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, my podcast is Exvangelical, and then my I have a newsletter called the Post-Evangelical Post. I like to say that all my things begin as puns. So, yeah. Thanks for having me on.
So could you introduce yourself a little, like where you're coming from, what your background is, and all that?
Sure. Yeah. I was born and raised in the Midwestern area in Indiana before moving to the Chicago suburbs uh, in the high school years. And throughout all of that, I was raised in different types of evangelicalism. We attended a United Methodist church growing up, but the way I like to describe the UM experience is that it sort of takes on a local flavor. So, small town Indiana and a relatively homogenous town is going to take on those characteristics. Whereas if you went to a UM church in a place like downtown Chicago, then you might have a very different type of experience and different people attending. Um, I was sort of swept up, as many people were in the 90s youth group culture. If any of your listeners have experience in evangelical Christianity and are of a certain age, that probably resonates. So at the ripe old age of 17, I felt the call to the ministry, chose my college based on that. Went to a college called Indiana Wesleyan, and that's where I sort of had my first faith crisis. Within the first week of school, we had was when 9/11 happened, and that changed the entire tenor of the entire culture in the United States. But in a place like that, there was a lot of cognitive dissonance between being somewhere where you're supposed to be learning about Jesus of Nazareth, this Prince of Peace type figure, but then culturally and politically, there's a lot of people sort of chomping at the bit to support that uh, the war effort and what would lead to the war in Iraq. And I was just in this weird sort of position where I was in history classes where there's a bit more of that conservative hawkish nature. Um, and then in my biblical classes, I was learning about how the Bible was constructed and all these other things. And because of that intense, taking it so seriously, um, process, I felt like I couldn't be qualified to be some sort of priest or pastor or anything. So I elected to not go to seminary or anything like that, but kept studying that aspects of religion. I eventually worked full time and got my master's part time and studied evangelical politics as it relates to environmentalism. Um, and tried, went through periods of heavy involvement and totally not going to church, culminating in like 2014, sort of deciding to part ways with the fundamentalist storefront church that we were attending in Chicago. Um, and then a couple of years later, that's when I decided to start a podcast called Exvangelical that really tried to explore why people were leaving that particular uh, faith practice and community. And yeah, I just thought a podcast would be best suited to that sort of work, because it can be open ended. You can hear people's stories in their own voices. And then as the body of work, culminates over time, then you can sort of see those patterns come into play. Um, I guess to sort of round that out, like since then, Exvangelical, I had an early part in like the hashtag initially catching on Twitter, and then the hashtag jump social networks from Instagram to TikTok. Now on TikTok, it has over 1.2 billion views, and so a lot of that energy from like 2016 to today has really been building on a lot of these other prior uh, prior movements that tried to reform evangelicalism from within. But generally, evangelicalism doesn't really want to be reformed. And now, because of things like social media, you can make a lot of these connections that used to be more like whisper networks. Like if you were in the 80s or 90s or 2000s or anything like that, and you left a church, then you'd probably go meet at a bar or something, and talk to your fellow apostates or people, backslidden people or whatever people call you. But now there's this whole sort of informational counterpublic is what some like uh, like sociologists may use that term to describe what has sort of happened since then, which is really really fascinating to be both a participant in it and an observer of it, and like see something like that um, come up. So yeah, that's my uh, somewhat brief history.
Um, could you explain in your own words what Christian nationalism is and how useful you think this term is?
Yeah, Christian nationalism. There have over the last, especially since January 6, 20, the J6 insurrection, it's definitely become a way in which we talk about um, a type of very toxic civil religion that really does crop up very much so in white evangelical spaces. But it is one of the things that is beneficial to the term is that it's not strictly denominational. So you can find Christian nationalist type tendencies within traditional Catholic backgrounds or other types of Christian denominations. Even you may find them in progressive backgrounds or progressive denominations, because some large denominations have rural places where those things may be more common, or even depending upon how those types of theologies enter a space or enter someone's sphere of influence through social media, through radio, through print media, whatever it might be. Generally, it's a type of media. Christian nationalism is what other folks have identified as, oftentimes it's really this idea of Christian supremacy within a nation. So, and there's usually also a strong racial component as well. So a lot of people expand on the term and call it, in particular, white Christian nationalism, because it privileges whiteness, heteronormativity, Christianity, generally Protestant Christianity, though Protestants may align themselves when it's beneficial in the political sphere with Catholics or others, even if secretly or in their heart of hearts, so to speak, they think that those are not the best type of Christian to be. But it is a type of worldview that really does privilege Christian, quote unquote Christian conservative outlooks and policies in the public sphere and wants those to be the rubric by which all Americans or any other country are measured against, and that they must be subject to that rule. And in general, that is built on something such like they believe that they should have a direct role in the governance of whatever country they are. Here in the context of America, of the United States of America, that means that is primarily expressed through conservative GOP candidates and things like that, and sitting Congress people and others. There's a lot of other things that sort of preface this emergence of the term Christian nationalism. It is valuable. I do. There are other movements that predate that term being popularized in the last few years in mass media. In particular, one that comes to mind that's very important is Christian Reconstruction, because a lot of Reconstructionist thought is what we are really talking about when we talk about the way in which these Christian organizations and individuals of great influence are trying to assert themselves in a dominant fashion. And Julie Ingersoll is the leading scholar on this. And even she will say, a lot of times people may be espousing Christian Reconstructionist type thoughts and beliefs, even if they can't articulate that, because Christian Reconstructionists decades ago were some of the early proponents of the Christian homeschool movement. And then these types of things are introduced early on into homeschool education. It's certainly a complex thing, and especially Christian Reconstructionists, they're working on a 200-year time scale or something, and that's not an exaggeration. That's within Ingersoll's work, and it's actually something we see having played out in how diligently they chipped away at Roe until it fell.
One consistent pattern that's shown up so far in reporting around this has been prominent Christian conservatives, people like Rod Dreher, for example,
Mm-hmm.
openly embracing the policies of the Polish Law and Justice Party, which recently banned abortion at the national level, and Viktor Orban's Hungary, which many political scientists have labeled as an illiberal democracy on its way to being a fully authoritarian regime. Um, what does this say about where the American Christian right, the evangelical movement is going? That you've got these figures openly flirting with these kind of governments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of that is where you'll find a lot of connection, and in what I've been able to read and follow, probably the best source that really articulates this is Sarah Posner's book Unholy, which really delves into the intellectual and political connections between what was the Trump administration, uh, as well as Viktor Orban's various periods of power in Hungary, and the way in which a lot of these far right intellectuals, political lobbyists, political activists, even these popular characters, really do network together. And then, in addition to folks like Rod Dreher, you have also seen in the last decade or so folks like Franklin Graham aligning and praising people like Vladimir Putin as really the scion of the protector of Christian family, and things like that. And it is absolutely troubling because these are authoritarian rulers. These are not people that value pluralistic democracy. Um, and that is certainly a troubling troubling trend. And it's not it the fact that it is far more blatant, um, and the fact that they have been so so vocal in the support and in their admiration of these movements. This was certainly not something, we talk sometimes in general about things like the Overton window. I don't think that prior conservatives, mainstream conservatives, would have been so forthright um in their praise of these folks before. But these are established networks, and some of the things that used to be more uh, done either out of the limelight, they're more confident that they will not lose their standing in the overall society, um, because of be, because they haven't really seen any consequences for it, right? Within their own movement or within society at large. Does that make sense? I mean, that's sort of my. I mean, do you feel similarly? Just to I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
I think that that feels like that's where they're going, that there's a very it's sort of a dynamic that feels a lot like the run up to, like, say, in the 1850s in the United States, when you look at the fire eater faction within the southern states that was consistently advocating for escalation and confrontation, and they were not just not meeting resistance, they were getting more and more support and resources
Mm-hmm.
as circumstances escalated. I mean, bit of a jump, but
Well, no, I do think, that is one of the elements, sort of pivoting back to the United States in particular. Another really good resource with regards to um, with regards to how this plays out in domestic politics is Project Blitz, which was unearthed by researcher Frederick Clarkson, and then also mentioned in Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers. And the Project Blitz um, is essentially a very coordinated attempt to introduce very extreme bills into state legislatures. And the intent is to introduce something extreme, knowing that it will fail, but then because that has opened opened the door essentially rhetorically, then they can introduce a slightly tamed down version that will eventually achieve their goals. And we're certainly seeing things like that in some of these culture war type things. Like, I can't believe that it's 2023 and we're talking about book banning and DeSantis overruling an AP African American Studies class. Like, these are the types of things that are the result of them pushing. And many of these sort of culture war things are surface level to a degree, and then people get tired of it. They atrophy, and then eventually they can introduce something that achieves their goals, and they're like, people might just shrug and be like, fine, give it to these people, but it still impacts the marginalized, oppressed groups who may be underrepresented, and then it just reifies the current situation, which is only beneficial to them. And that that's really. And the other thing, I just talked with Teddy Wilson in my own podcast. He covers the far right, and all of these far right groups, even if they're not directly networking, they're watching one another and they're seeing what works in their respective countries. So so the insurrectionists in the United States gave ideas to what happened in Brazil and in other countries recently. So it's definitely worrisome. And I'm being very timid in that. Like, you know.
On sort of on that particular note, do you think that on one hand we've seen things like the Supreme Court basically overturning Roe v. Wade, among many other things, as well as like some signaling that that might be the first step and not the last. But on the other hand, you had a lot of Republican candidates in the United States running on explicitly Christian nationalist platforms and managed to get like a two-seat majority, which, you know, knowing US politics, that will probably go because at least 5 or 6 members of Congress resign every session because of insert here whatever reason,
Mhm.
um and didn't take the Senate in what was supposed to be a contest they would win. So do you think that this sort of contrast of, on one hand, there's institutions that have given them what they've wanted, but on the other, there's ones that haven't, like, do you think this is going to encourage more extra legal violence? Do you think there's going to be more pushes around like established channels or like some kind of mix of the two?
Yeah, I mean, it is very hard to meaningfully predict the future. But some of the fact that you know, Christian nationalists, uh, the most extreme example, extreme might not be the best word, but the most blatant example was, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene selling merch that says proud Christian nationalist on it and saying, I'm proud to be called a Christian nationalist. That is very culture warry. It's very, you know, facile and easy. It's like easy points online to say such things, but it does legitimate it as it does allow it to have a presence in those spaces. And the modern GOP has been very, very good at exploiting institutional weaknesses. So even if there even if there are uh, people who are Republican who, for whatever reason, do continue to vote that way, um, even if they don't like the sort of extremism that is a part of the party, um, those things that we see even in the recent House majority, I'm sorry, House Speaker elections, the only way that that was resolved was by ceding power to people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who now have committee appointments and now are closer to levers of power. And Matt Gaetz sought a pardon for his involvement in the insurrection. We know these things, but those exploiting institutional weaknesses and allowing for that type of politicking to be done for so long. I mean, the within living millennial memory, like I'm an elder millennial, so I'm almost 40. Um, and like the politics I remember growing up were like my early memories was, you know, the first Iraq War with Bush Senior, Newt Gingrich, and Rush Limbaugh. You know, it's always been dirty. There's always been this element of Republican politics, um, in my lifetime that's always been that way. And at the same time, up until Trumpism entering the picture, you know, they also tried to hang their hat on being the party of family values and being Christian and that sort of thing. But it's all been reduced to identity, at least at that level. You know, when it comes to the policies that are in place and the actual policy making that happens in DC and in other state legislatures, I don't know, but the face that they give to the country at that large level is primarily represented by that. And that, I'm curious on your thoughts, but that's sort of that's sort of how I read what they've um, permitted in their own ranks for so long.
Yeah, I'm also, remember the Bush years and was like, about yay tall when the first Iraq war happened, or I don't know, maybe that'll be the third one, depending on how historians end up numbering all the conflicts in that region. But the both that there is that like I remember there's always been that sort of nastiness within that element of American conservative politics, at
Mm-hmm.
least as I've remembered it. Um, and it also seems like it's giving license to physical violence in some ways of things like the Club Q shooting, the
Mm-hmm.
confrontations at drag shows that like I'm not sure how much of that is these people feeling like they're being legitimized by what's happening versus they feel like what's happening is not happening fast enough.
Right. Yeah, and I didn't really touch on that part of your question. And the tolerance for really for that is this rhetoric does make purchase in someone who may be prone to violence or may be facing some other mental health problem that allows them to justify a really heinous act against by and large uh, and oppressed communities, whether that's trans people, people of color, uh, queer people, or the intersections of all those identities. And absolutely, like Talia Levin's book really gets into some of these extremist online spaces, and that is that is part of this sort of ecosystem too. And the fact that so much of our life, even though we're no longer in the sort of extreme lockdown type environment that we still live a very mediated life. Many of us, or if not most of us, do. And that's part of the same ecosystem of what's available in far right spaces online. They say really they misgender trans people, and all of this degradation of human dignity does lead you to devalue even their lives. And this is certainly something that we've seen in history, and it's terrible that we're seeing it again, and it should be condemned, like I don't yeah so it's one of those things that makes me stumble over my words. I don't even know what to say. It's just awful.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that I definitely prefer seeing staying in the history books,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to being acted out now.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely.
To take things in a slightly different direction, because there isn't just, the whole question of what are these like the what is this movement doing, but also these aren't things that are just happening in a vacuum of they're going out and doing stuff and getting what they want. So to move to sort of the other side of that coin, how much have these developments of things like increasingly extreme social conservatism, tacit support for like different levels of violent rhetoric and action and all that, how has that impacted the exvangelical movement?
I think you're seeing I think what you're seeing is, I don't know whether there's a direct connection or not. That's a very interesting question. I do think that you are seeing people in their process of um, of essentially what's often called deconstruction. So so just to speak a little bit about the exvangelical movement first. In general, this is like a very ad hoc, organic movement. There, in that way, mirrors the evangelicalism we came from. Some of the defenders of white evangelicalism in particular say, there's no pope of evangelicalism. There's also no pope of people who've left evangelicalism. But a key difference is that white evangelicalism has about 200 years of institutional weight behind it, and with that comes finances and resources and cultural norms and so many other things. Whereas, there's just a whole bunch of people with iPhones and Androids out there talking to their screen and sharing it with the world, and they're threatened by that, which is a wild thing. So you will see people, especially with something like white evangelicalism that can be identified as being majority white, or white led. A lot of folks who come from that, are processing what they're seeing and reckoning with all the parts of the term white Christian nationalism. So they may, to varying degrees, be start to become aware of the role whiteness has had in their life, in their faith, in their communities, as well as the ways in which Christian nationalism has shaped their own experience and some of their prior beliefs about politics and governance and things like that. Because there is a lot going on because of the increased extremism in the popular GOP in the last several years, like going back at least into the racist response, within the Tea Party to their Obama being president, through to Trumpism, through to today. All of that became far more part of the mainstream expression of conservatism, and that doesn't square with with what the values that we were supposedly taught. And that leads folks to start to question, well, what the hell do you actually value? And then oftentimes seeing people, whether in their families or other parts of their social circle, really double down into these things. And that is one of the more direct things. And then you will now see people decrying or denouncing Christian nationalism as an informed ex-evangelical. They can say, I came from this place, these things happened to me, I changed my mind, and now I'm against this. That is certainly powerful within being able to speak to something. Now, there's not necessarily like any super PAC that's funding people's TikToks and stuff or podcasts. There's not an equivalent to the Family Research Council working within DC and other state legislatures or anything. So it's still a very nascent sort of expression of people leaving this space, but they, at least in their individual lives, they're working against it. And I think that they're a valuable part of that discussion, because there are some things, there are some ecumenical efforts, like the Baptist Joint Committee in DC has Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and that's been active since, I believe, 2019. But then people who leave a faith group sort of become invisible to people that participate in other faith groups, whether they're progressive or conservative. So I see it sort of still primarily acting out in all these individual lives. I'm not sure what it might take for it to become more coalesced into something that's organized. That's always something that's harder in more progressive spaces, is to agree on a platform or whatever it might be, because they're just more prone to proliferation of opinions and desires than the counterparts that might be more willing to sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of fall in line and follow a leader or that sort of thing, and toe that party line. So that's sort of where I see it with regard to where ex-evangelicals are. Have you seen anything different, like in your observation? I don't, and I'm actually really curious. Have you, within pagan communities, or the types of communities you're a part of, whether it's online or in person, is there sort of an animated desire to respond to Christian nationalism?
I think what it is, and part of it is the process of people like coming into the pagan community is very similar to what you were describing around folks coming to like an ex-evangelical position and like leaving their particular denominations. Like the one, like the only like the one significant difference is that ecological like consciousness tends to be a particularly significant element of that in a lot of conversations I've had with pagans anyway.
Mm-hmm.
There does seem to like there are a lot of folks who did originally come from like particularly like conservative Christian denominations. So there is, I think, a general awareness of what has like what's going on and what's in these movements. And there is
Mm-hmm.
also a bit of history in the sense of like the leftovers of the Satanic Panic and the Satanic Panic itself, that that wasn't something that I was around for, but like the previous generation of pagans before me had to go a lot deeper underground than they already were, because people were being locked up on trumped up charges of child molestation and all kinds of other things.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember like growing up in the 90s that sort of culturally sort of was a hangover well until like September 11th at the latest, I think. So I think like there's like it's not something that's well publicized, and there's always usually other stuff that comes it gets involved, but there are definitely instances that come up now and then in different parts of the country of somebody being fired for being outed as a pagan practitioner. And more or
Mm-hmm.
less nothing happening in response to it, for a
Mm-hmm.
variety of different reasons. So I think like there's always been something of a like a background awareness, but I I wouldn't exactly say that there's an organized push that's happening yet.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. Uh, because I mean, I have seen, folks who have left evangelicalism will explore some element of paganism, whether it's like, even if it's to use really online terms, because this is my exposure to these things primarily, is like you might see someone that is like doing things like witch talk, or like something pagan related, or is incorporating, part of, if they have an indigenous background or an indigenous spirituality of any sort, then they may be exploring those parts of spiritual practice and incorporating that. So like I'm sure that there's overlap between specifically pagan communities um and people who've left evangelicalism, who use terms like exvangelical, for even if it's for like a season, because um rather, I try to be self-conscious about the fact that my role in this, especially with regard to my podcast, is it's for people to really sort of explore various options when they're starting that out. There are other people even within like a podcast ecosystem that have other roles or have other focuses. But I definitely have seen that, where someone will venture into exploring something with regard to paganism or witchcraft, or other types of like an earth-based spirituality or things like that. And I mean, uh is besides like all the various, I can't believe, besides all the various religious traumas that having a conservative religious upbringing is it usually something like with regard to, you know, develop a deepening appreciation for the earth, or for like the threat of climate change, or for valuing that sort of thing that draws people from that you're aware of from something like evangelicalism to paganism?
I think it's there to different degrees. It's not always necessarily like because there's different ways people approach that as well, because some focus much more like in their immediate area of things like, doing beach cleanups and stuff like that, or uh on one end, and then on the other hand, you have like folks that, I mean, and I'm kind of more on this end, but folks like Rune Rasmussen with the Nordic Animism channel, who it like regularly like promotes like environmental defense actions, and there's definitely like quite a bit of overlap that's in there. So I think there is like the sense of climate change, or even just like a connection to land that they lived on,
Mm-hmm.
like because it really runs the gamut there. But I think that
Yeah.
that's, I mean, and that's not always necessarily the thing, because I know there's also folks that like come to um a pagan practice from like a Christian background initially, sort of doing the, it's the thing that mom and dad will absolutely hate.
And I can see that too. There is oftentimes, at least from, my faith of origin, like if you reject it, then you sort of go through a second adolescence. It's part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's part of the whole figuring out one's identity when it's
Hmm.
something that's so big.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And because a lot of the rites of passage that might be part of another spirituality's practice are sort of stripped from something like evangelicalism, and they have been for so long that it might be multiple generations haven't really had that. So it's not just millennials and Gen Z leaving these things. It never has been, and it won't be. It's Yeah. So anyways.
What is the thing that you think is most important for people who aren't from a Christian conservative background, or are not involved in the exvangelical movement, to understand about um, what is happening in the Christian right and with Christian nationalism today?
um that's a really good question. uh I'm trying to think of the best place to start. I mean, by and large, um and I'm not sure whether this is specific to solely the Christian right, though, because a lot of times when you've studied these things for a while, then you want to delve into all of the various idiosyncrasies of terms and things like that, because there were fundamentalists in the late 19th, early 20th century. Then they tried to shed that term, and then like in the 1960s there was a group called the New Evangelicals that tried to sort of shave off the fundamentalist sharp edges. And then in the 70s, with the rise of the modern religious right, um, those were the things that uh, that really codified much of conservative politics in the United States ever since then. Um, was this sort of alignment between folks like Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrich, and like all these figures that may or may not be known to the broader populace. Um, some of the things that I think are still not yet penetrating the broader consciousness about the Christian right, uh, is that the things that animated the formation of the religious right was not abortion. It was the fact that the IRS was going to strip Bob Jones University, one a very very conservative, segregated, discriminatory college, from receiving federal funding because of their segregation practices. That's what animated them to become more involved in politics. And there was a very strong contingent of white evangelicals who always wanted to uphold white supremacy. Oftentimes, some of the white evangelicals that have access to microphones and megaphones at places like the New Yorker and the New York Times and elsewhere, they will emphasize um, the abolitionist trends within white evangelical history. People like Jonathan Blanchard, all these who founded Wheaton, all these things. These At the same time, though, there have been books by really powerful authors like Dr. Anthea Butler at the University of Pennsylvania called White Evangelical Racism, and it shows that that much of white evangelicalism was instituted and practiced discriminatory things that privileged whiteness over and above over and above any other type of Americanism. And yes, there's this entire part of our of white evangelical history that is not really taught or talked about in our churches and in Christian schools. And instead of that, you have people like David Barton, who positions himself as a historian, but he's creating a myth about the foundation of Christianity in America, the foundation of the government, and those myths are very animating and powerful. And myths can function as they don't have to be true to be powerful. Like we can know that a myth is false. Like I can draw on, you know, I can draw on a myth from a religion that I don't know. Like Greek mythology is still has power. So does Norse stories. Like these things, you know, you know, Odin hanging on the world tree, like that's evocative. um, but at the same time, you these things have formed a very significant part of our country. Um, and the people that have taken some sort of time to talk about their experience of leaving these types of spaces, there's a lot to be gained from listening to those voices. And you don't have to listen to me. Like there's people, and there are also communities, you know, deconstruction type communities that are focused on the Black experience, there or on other types of deconstruction of people who've left this particular type of religious community or religious outlook. And right now, as it stands, this is still a very nascent expression of this movement. There have always been people who have tried to reform evangelicalism, to push it in a more moderate or progressive way. Deborah Jean Lee was a journalist who, in her youth, was part of the evangelical church. She's Asian American, and then she later in life wrote the book Rescuing Jesus, which told the stories of gay students and others on Christian campuses that did these similar types of things. There's another book that's going to be coming out this year called The Other Evangelicals. There are lots of these stories of people that have tried to, but what's been demonstrated time and again, especially in the last few years, is these spaces don't want to reform. Like they want they feel convicted you know, that this patriarchal view of Christianity is the correct one, and they are not interested. Um, and that leads to a lot of people leaving, and they feel vindicated to a degree that they stood up for what they believe. Um, but then now we have this thing introduced directly into the myth making. January 6th, to Bradley Onishi, one of my friends and fellow podcasters. In the shadow of January 6th, he wrote an op-ed that has unfortunately come true, that January 6th was the origin myth of a new civil religion. And that encapsulates white Christian nationalism. That includes white Christian nationalism. And we should be aware of it. We should know how to recognize it, and how, whether it's relationally or really vocally, um, resisting it, rejecting it, and saying that that is not something that we want present in our politics or in our churches or things like that. And it will require a lot of bravery on people's part. Um, but there are people who sort of have that lived experience as well as that education. And I mean, like anything with religion, a lot of times, especially as it intersects with public life, there's a problem unless you believe the same exact thing or whatever else. You're probably going to disagree. It's not always going to be a comfortable conversation. um, but if we value our democracy, then we should make it we should make it a priority to be able to have those difficult conversations when we're able to.
And do you have any last like thoughts or anything you want to wrap up on?
um, I mean, I hope that this has been valuable. um, a lot of times I don't speak about things in this regard. I usually I'm on the other side of the mic asking someone else to to answer these similar questions. If it would be valuable to your audience, I would mention that in 2020 I recorded a limited series called Powers and Principalities. It's all about white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism, and I interviewed authors. Kristen Kobus-Dumay, who's a gender historian, Anthea Butler, Reza Aslan, Jeff Charlotte, a number of people that have various types of expertise. Um, it's a real it was a real treat to be able to talk to all of them. Julie Ingersoll, who I also mentioned earlier. So if that's valuable, and I mean, I think the only other thing that I also would be curious to talk about and hear from you about a little bit was, do you think there's opportunities or places where people in more, like in your space and in a space like mine, would have opportunities to either interact or learn from one another? Because I'm always sort of curious. I think that is one of the things that will need to come in a sort of robust response to Christian nationalism is interfaith coalitions. And I feel like interfaith is almost limiting, because like I think it should also extend to atheists and nuns and stuff. Maybe you're of the same mind, uh but that to me is one potential solution, right? Is to try to find those points of connection.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, I mean, we absolutely need that, because if we're going to not just, effectively confront this, but also build something that could be, described as kind of a benign sort of secular pluralism or something like that, then there's going to have to be those relationships and that work done beforehand before we can get to, having a civil society that says, okay, we're going to respect a diversity of spiritual and religious expression. that first, we have to get all the different spiritual and religious expressions involved to at least agree to sort of a baseline. We will be okay with each other, kind of thing,
Right. Yeah. 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 And I think that has to be part of like planning these things is like I'm glad you emailed me sort of and reached out because because these are the types of things that I think will lead to that type of thing happening.
Thank you again for being on, Blake. Where can people find you online?
The place where I most often show up these days is yes, I do have a Substack. So it's postevangelicalpost.com. That is where I publish both my newsletter as well as the primary podcast I do, Exvangelical. If if you're still on Elon's Twitter, I'm there occasionally at Br Chastain, and then just at Br Chastain underscore on Instagram and TikTok. But I'm not on social media. I don't live on social media like I used to. So best place to go is postevangelicalpost.com.
Thank you again for being on. It's been great having you. And this has been Ryan Smith with Streams of Resistance as part of the Wayward Wanderer. Now signing off. Thank you
Thank
for
you, Ryan.
tuning in. Thank you, Blake. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to help support more work like this, then please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you early access to podcast episodes, ad-free listening, monthly patrons-only live stream sessions with your host and author of The Way of Fire and Ice, Ryan Smith, and more. Please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. Thanks for listening.